This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. So, over the last couple of weeks, whilst doing the research for this episode, there's one story that's been ringing in my head the entire time, known as the farmer and the donkey, where in the story, there's this old farmer and his son. Now, they were poor and they worked hard, and they relied on their trusty donkey to plough the fields and help them get their goods to market. Now, as part of the story, this farmer's donkey runs away into the mountains, and so the villagers come to the farmer and say, "Oh, what bad luck you have." But the farmer just says, "We'll see." And the farmer's right, as just a few days later, the donkey returns from the mountains, bringing with it 3 other donkeys it had befriended on its trip. And so the villagers return, and everyone proclaims, "Oh, what good luck you have." But the farmer just says, "We'll see." A couple of days later, when his son is trying to tame one of these donkeys, he falls off the donkey and breaks his leg. And so the villagers return and, "Oh, what bad luck you have." But the farmer, again, just says, "We'll see." As a few days later, when the king's men come through and conscript all the able-bodied men in town, his son avoids the draft and is able to stay home due to the broken leg. And so the village once again proclaims what good luck he has. But the farmer simply says, "We'll see." From my point of view, it's a story about perspective, about how quickly we label events as good or bad without really knowing how they might play out in the long run. And throughout the research of the episode, I really couldn't stop seeing the parallels between the farmer and Timor Leste, a tiny nation that's been through more twists and turns than just about any other country in the world. As when the nation, due to the timing of riots on the other side of the planet, was set to gain their independence nearly bloodlessly, I can hear that farmer saying, "We'll see." And he's right, because the Indonesians respond to that by invading the country and carrying out a brutal occupation for 20 years. But I can still hear the farmer saying, "We'll see." As when the resistance continues and the Indonesians are eventually forced out decades later, unlike the 1975 elections, these new elections can be run without a pro-Indonesia party, not only backed by far more geopolitical allies, but also given far more time and support to build up its institutions and the bedrock for a stable democracy, rather than simply rushing to take advantage of the situation. But again, I can hear the farmer saying, "We'll see." So when Timor-Leste gained independence in 2002, finally entering into the 21st century as its own independent state, to most, a good luck moment if there ever was one. But now being an independent state, then come the challenges. Like building a democracy from scratch, trying to operate a legal system when all the lawyers have left the country, and managing a young and growing population in a country that Indonesia built very little infrastructure. So to some, it could feel like bad luck. But in another stroke of good luck, the Timorese also discover vast oil and gas reserves, enough to power the Timorese economy and provide it with the leg up that it never had under both Indonesia or Portugal. Seemingly another stroke of good luck. However, then there's the farmer saying, "We'll see." And he's right, as it's not that simple. As right now, a lot of that oil is actually running out. The country's economy has now become almost entirely dependent on it, and the negotiations over the new oil fields are mired in geopolitical tensions and arguably bad faith arguments. This is not only a country that's been through it all, but is also now facing several converging crises all at once. And yet, where it goes next, I think maybe only that farmer would know. But to attempt to figure it out and understand how Timor arrived at the position it's currently in, where its former occupiers are now its largest trading partners, where its former defenders are also the ones spying on them, and the resource that saved their economy may also be the same one to doom it, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. A booming neighborhood.
Timor-Leste is a smaller country to the northwest of Australia in a reasonably strategic location there on the Indian Ocean.
Michael Leach is a professor of politics and international relations, specialising in Timor-Leste and the politics of the Pacific at Swinburne University. Having written numerous analysis pieces on the country, including the Routledge Handbook on Contemporary Timor-Leste, he's one of the go-to analysts on the country's affairs, so we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
was a Portuguese colony for 450 years, then invaded and occupied by Indonesia in 1975, leading to a 24-year struggle for the restoration of its independence and a period of direct UN governance from 1999 to 2002.
Now, for anyone who hasn't looked at a map or thought about Timor very much, the country finds itself in a pretty strategically significant part of the map, situated within the Indonesian archipelago, approximately 500 kilometres northwest of Australia. Now, as you'd expect, the reason that people used to call it East Timor is because the country only controls about half the island it actually sits on, with Dili, the capital, being in control of the eastern half of the island, a small handful of islands, and another relatively small exclave known as Okusi, with the rest of the island being controlled by Indonesia and its capital Jakarta 2,000 kilometres away. Now, as we've covered in previous episodes, Indonesia itself is an incredibly diverse archipelago, home to a pretty wide range of ethnic and cultural identities, some of which are vastly different from the dominant Javanese population. And just like Aceh in the northwest and West Papua in the very east of the country, Timor Leste stands out as being very ethnically different from the rest of the Indonesian archipelago. The population being predominantly Austronesian, sharing more ancestry with those in Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands than they would with the average Javanese. But if the Timorese, who live in both Indonesian-controlled West Timor and Dili-controlled East Timor, are so different from the Javanese, why is it that Timor-Leste was the only one to become an independent state?
Yeah, that's a legacy of competitive colonialism. The division, as it were, between a so-called East and West Timor is not what you might call an indigenous division. It's a result of competition from the 16th century onwards, and particularly the 17th and 18th centuries between the Dutch and the Portuguese colonial empires in this region. And the Portuguese, over a long period of time, established themselves more firmly in east the island of Timor, with the exception of the exclave of Okusi, which is in West Timor and is part of East Timorese territory today, and the Dutch in West Timor. So in the late 1940s, when Indonesia obtained its independence from the Netherlands, West Timor became a province of Indonesia, and East Timor remained a Portuguese colony until 1975. As a result, they've had different trajectories since the early colonial era.
Now, as usual, we're going to oversimplify a very complex history, as there's a lot to get to in this episode. But whilst Indonesia in the 1940s had become independent, it would take quite a few more decades before Timor-Leste would enjoy the same freedoms. As right through the 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s, Timor-Leste, known as Portuguese Timor at the time, but acting as a territory of Portugal in a similar manner to how French Guyana or Tahiti are managed by the French today. However, in 1974, Portugal underwent the Carnation Revolution, a left-wing movement in the country that set off a chain of decolonialization throughout the Portuguese territories. Now, in East Timor, the Revolutionary Front for an Independent East Timor, or Fretilin, who will become much more important later on, they would seize on the opportunity by declaring independence. And due to the government change in Lisbon, the Portuguese would make very little effort to try and seize back its territory. And so by November 1975, the newly independent East Timor would hold elections to decide the first government of the country. Local elections would get underway, with the first results coming back suggesting that it would be the left-wing party Fretilin likely to win the national election, securing victory over the Timorese Democratic Union, a more right-leaning party that had close ties with the Indonesian government. But seeing as Fretilin made the cardinal mistake of being a left-wing government in Asia at the time, some of the surrounding great powers were going to have absolutely none of that. The most concerned being the Suharto government in Indonesia, who at the time would seek assurances from Washington as to what they planned to do about this new left-wing government in Timor. However, at the time, Washington was much more focused on what was going on at home, with the US showing very little interest in getting involved in the situation, possibly due to the fact that the Timorese had rudely declared their independence during what would be Thanksgiving that year in the United States. So Washington would simply tell Jakarta that whilst it wouldn't explicitly endorse an invasion, they also wouldn't intervene if Jakarta decided to act, and that if they were going to do so, they should probably do it quickly. And so, with this tacit green light, Indonesia would launch a full-scale invasion of the rest of the island, sending troops into East Timor in December of 1975, unleashing a wave of crackdowns and seizing control of the territory. And by July of 1976, the region had been declared as Indonesia's 27th province. Now at the time, Indonesia's annexation of the province was criticised by most of the world, with the only country to recognise the annexation unfortunately being Australia, giving me the same sense of national shame that a British person probably feels every time they go to a museum. Now, why Australia would recognise them, we'll come back to later, as right now, we're just trying to speedrun to the independence period. So over the next 2 decades, Indonesia's occupation of East Timor would be marked by systemic repression and violence, with some estimates even suggesting that as many as 200,000 Timorese, or nearly a third of the population, would be killed due to conflict, starvation, or forced displacement. And despite this, Timorese resistance forces, including Fretland, would continue to push back against the Indonesians, gradually weakening Jakarta's control of the rest of the island. And as these incidents continued to stack on, Indonesia would draw more and more criticism from the international community, particularly after the 1991 Santa Cruz massacre, when journalists managed to capture footage of Indonesian soldiers opening fire on a funeral procession in Dili, killing somewhere between 60 and 250 civilians. So with political pressure mounting from most of the world, and resistance pressure mounting on the island, by the time the Indonesians reached 1998, and the Asian financial crisis would be crippling the Indonesian economy, Suharto, the country's long-term dictator, would be forced out of power. And seeing as the occupation was becoming both politically and militarily expensive, when incoming President B.J. Habibie would come into power, Jakarta would announce plans to grant East Timor special regional autonomy and let them set up a limited government on their half of the island. But in addition to this, he would also allow the Timorese to have their own referendum on whether they wanted to pursue full independence, with the Timorese going to the polls in August of 1999, the results of which would be decisive, with 78.5% of the country voting in favour of independence. And so for the second time in 3 decades, the East Timorese would declare independence. And whilst all sounds good from that point, the transition into independence was anything but smooth, with some elements of the Indonesian military relaunching reprisals back into the newly independent Timor, causing even more deaths and forcing tens of thousands more to flee the country. However, 1999 was very different to 1975, and through diplomacy and peacekeeping missions, the Indonesians would be forced to pull back into their half of the island, and Australian and UN peacekeeping missions would replace them here in the east. So Michael, what I want to ask you is to give us a bit of an insight here. Why is it that other independence movements here in Indonesia, like Aceh in the very northwest and West Papua in the very east of the country, haven't been able to gain independence from Jakarta, and yet Timor Leste actually managed to do so? What made their struggle different from the other two?
Yes, it's an apt parallel to make. One, the West Papuan provinces these days generate a lot more income for the Indonesian state than Timor-Leste ever did. That's one of the key reasons. The other reason is to do with the nature of the resistance. From the Civil War period of 1975, it managed to unify the different elements of the resistance within about 10 or 12 years of the Indonesian invasion. It consisted of 3 fronts: the diplomatic front, led by José Ramos Horta, who's now the president, and under the overall command of Xanana Gusmao, who was in the territory for much of that time before his arrest, leading the military resistance. And of course, there was also a clandestine resistance. The bottom line is they were very unified and managed to form and forge international connections with international solidarity movements very effectively. And so when Indonesia went through the economic crisis of the late 90s and the Suharto regime started to fall, they were very well placed to push for independence and self-determination at that point.
So how would you describe the Indonesians pulling back into the west of the island? What sort of impact did it have here in the east?
It's worth bearing in mind that the departing Indian forces destroyed a lot of infrastructure. A lot of the skilled workers, policymakers, bureaucrats, doctors, teachers left. They were from other parts of Indonesia. And the East Timorese themselves typically had lower level jobs in the Indonesian administration. So there was a massive exodus and loss of what you might call human resources at that point. And Timor has had to build from that point. And of course, it's only been 23 years since the restoration of independence.
Today, the two halves of the island have developed into very distinct political and economic entities, each with its own governance structures and way of life, with the Indonesian-administered parts of West Timor having approximately 2.3 million people, and an economy largely centred around agriculture, fisheries and forestry, while Timor-Leste, with a population of about 1.3 million, has become overly reliant on a single resource: oil. And to understand how reliant, just since 2007, revenues from the country's petroleum fund have accounted for over 86.2% of the state's financing, placing East Timor as one of the most oil-dependent economies anywhere in the world. Now, that's obviously something we're going to get into in more detail later on, but to go beyond just these economic differences and unpack this a bit more, how would you compare the two halves of the island?
If you were to look at the Freedom House, for example, and look at freedom rankings and look at the freedom of the press and look at civil liberties, respect for civil liberties and so on, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom to form parties, it would be the other way around. Timor-Leste would be performing better than West Timor. But of course, economically, Timor-Leste has a lot of the characteristics of an oil state. It's very dependent on the oil and gas revenues, 90%. The big challenge for Timor-Leste is to economically diversify before those finite resources do run out, whenever that might be. And that's proved a sticky proposition over the last 20 years. It's very easy for states that have this influx of oil and gas revenues to rely on rather than to promote alternative industries to economically diversify. It's fair to say that since independence, there has been a relative underinvestment in some basic development indicators around education, health and agriculture. That would be part of that equation.
And what about the infrastructure? How would you compare the two there?
People who go to West Timor often see it as the roads are better, although I've been places in West Timor where I would question that. But West Timor is an outlying region of Indonesia. But if you were to look at the indigenous societies of East and West Timor, you would in fact see quite a lot of similarities in those clan-based societies where there's a lot of importance to adat or tradition, lisan. You would see a lot more parallels on the island of Timor if you start looking at things that predate the era of competitive colonialism and their successor states.
One of the other key fundamental differences between the two halves of the island is how each of these governments generate revenue. As whilst the west of Timor, as part of Indonesia, can directly benefit from fiscal transfers and subsidies coming in from other parts of Indonesia, Timor-Leste instead has to entirely rely on its own resources to fund government operations, with there also being a number of other economic challenges that compound some of these difficulties for Dili, one of which being the fact that the country still uses the US dollar as their official currency, making it much more difficult for the government to do economic stimulus, and making them subject to fluctuations within the strength of the dollar. On top of that, there's also the added problem that only about 20% of the population actually live in the capital, reducing a lot of inefficiencies and forcing the government to build infrastructure in areas where it's more expensive to do so. Probably the largest difficulty for the government, though, would be the fact that only about 25% of the workforce, a quarter, are actually employed in the formal sector. In other words, actually being paid into a bank account and filing taxes, making it incredibly difficult for the government to levy taxes or generate internal revenue from 75% of the population. So, Michael, what impact does this have long-term on Timor-Leste's economic capabilities?
Yes, well, one thing I think immediately to understand is there's a very high level of subsistence reliance in Timor-Leste. So when you see figures like only 25% are in the formal economy, you've got to remember that there's really quite a large proportion still, especially in rural Timor-Leste, who are subsistence farmers. So they're growing food in order to eat it, like they have since time immemorial. And then they're typically trading any excess on the local market for other goods, earning a little bit of revenue to send their kids to school. So when it comes to Timor-Leste, like a lot of societies in the Pacific, rather than a lot of societies in Southeast Asia, you've got to take into account that factor. Now, that said, it's a youth-dominated population and there's increasing rural-urban migration. So it is a big challenge for Timor-Leste, which has a median age of 21. And you compare that to a country like Australia where it's almost twice that.
And that pretty nicely brings me to my next question about the state of politics in Timor-Leste. As whilst Timor-Leste's population is overwhelmingly young, its political leadership remains dominated by a much older generation, many of whom have actually held power in some manner since the country's independence. In fact, as things stand today, both the President and Prime Minister have both previously served in these exact roles back in the 2000s. With both of these men also having made their name during the revolutionary and independence periods. So how do we end up in a situation where such a youthful population is still being governed by these same political figures who've been in power now for nearly 3 decades?
Yeah, it's a good question. The old firm is back in power since the last round of elections with José Ramos Horta as president and Xanana Guzmão as prime minister. Part of this is to do with the history of Timor-Leste. It was a successful, in the end, self-determination struggle over 25 years. And what that means is a lot of those elders, and Timor-Leste is a society that already respects its elders in a traditional sense, have a lot of symbolic authority in that country, having led the country through very difficult circumstances in a very difficult struggle over 25 years. And have, by and large, done a reasonably good job with some eruptions of disunity of keeping that kind of sense of national unity going after independence. So they have a lot of substantial personal legitimacy is one of those reasons. That said, absolutely, people have been talking for some time now about political transitions to a younger generation. There isn't a political party out there now that isn't acutely aware of the need to appeal to young people when it comes to election time.
Staying on politics for a moment, as youth unemployment continues to rise in the country, some of these younger voices are beginning to become increasingly loud, particularly as both the ruling party, the CNRT, and the second largest party, Fretilin, remain dominated by this same independence-era generation. And when combined with the fact that both these parties are either left or centre-left, there has been reports of growing frustration among some of these younger voters, a large chunk of which feel both disconnected with politics and increasingly worried about the country's economic future. And as a result, we're starting to see a trend of young people gravitating towards newer political movements, particularly toward political parties like Kunto, who managed to gain traction with large parts of the young population through its ties to martial arts groups, these being pretty influential organisations within the country's socio-political landscape. So while for now, as long as oil revenues continue to keep the economy buoyant, some of these underlying tensions can be sort of put aside, if the country does go through an economic downturn sometime in the future, will we start to see politics drifting towards some of these new parties? Parties that some analysts worry don't have the same unifying political presence to be able to unite Timor-Leste's over 30 clans. What does this all mean for governance going forward?
There are concerns about martial arts groups, for example, and their influence on some political parties, and that is to do with, in part, with the large number of, especially young male, unemployed people in the cities, away from those traditional lifestyles.
Now, admittedly, the Timorese government has been working pretty hard and try and paint a much brighter future for the country going forward, with one of the key efforts being undertaken to do this being the Timorese efforts to try and join the Southeast Asian organisation, ASEAN, as the move would formally integrate East Timor into Southeast Asia's primary economic and political bloc. However, despite being geographically within ASEAN's boundaries, to date, Timor-Leste remains the only state in the region to still yet gain full membership, and the road to ascension has been anything but smooth, with some of ASEAN's more affluent member states, most notably Singapore, having raised serious concerns as to whether Timor-Leste has the economic capacity to be able to function as a contributing member of the organisation, asserting that the Timorese are quite likely to become an economic burden on the group. So, in your opinion, where does Timor-Leste's bid for ASEAN membership go from here?
Well, yes, that was Singapore's position for some time. Singapore, for a long time, was concerned that it would be another vote for Indonesia in ASEAN. And while I'm sure that's not true, it is true that the big sponsor of Timor-Leste's potential accession to ASEAN has always been Indonesia. Look, ASEAN accession does come with a lot of milestones the acceding state has to meet, and they were laid out in a document a couple of years ago for Timor-Leste. ASEAN has more recently moderated some of those milestones, and a lot of the signs point to, I think, the growing likelihood that Timor-Leste will be admitted to ASEAN. There are certainly NGOs in Timor-Leste that are quite concerned about ASEAN accession for the reasons that you mentioned. It does place a lot of burdens on the state. We've seen a state like Samoa recently, for example, tell international donors that they're only available for meetings every third week or so because those meetings are putting such a drain on the domestic public service that they are neglecting domestic policy. Now, Timor-Leste is a much larger state than Samoa, but nonetheless, it does require a lot of resources to staff all the requirements of ASEAN accession, and that will be a challenge for Timor-Leste.
Well, if it doesn't have success with ASEAN, do you think Australia, as well as the states in ASEAN, should be concerned that some of the difficulties here might push Dili toward Beijing?
In that context, I think my research in the Pacific, which looks at popular political attitudes, suggests very strong values alignment with traditional donors, not only in Timor-Leste, but a lot of countries in the Pacific. So in that new geostrategic competition for influence, I think traditional donors like Australia, New Zealand, the US, Japan, and so on are extremely well placed to take advantage of what you would call a values alignment with those Pacific nations. And secondly, the other point to make is when you look at donors to places like Timor-Leste, China does have some important and well-regarded and valued programs there, but they would come in around fourth or fifth in terms of overall aid levels to Timor-Leste, frequently in the form of large buildings. I know that those relationships with China are valued by the Timorese leadership, but they are well behind countries like Australia, even Portugal, and the EU and the United States at present in terms of the amount of aid that's going into Timor-Leste. And of course, that's a very important consideration. One of the realities of the new geostrategic game is that all small and medium-sized countries in the region are aware that they now have a certain amount of leverage against traditional donors because of the rise of China as a potential partner. There's no doubt about that. You do see some outliers, some governments in Solomon Islands, Kiribati, that have perhaps taken that to a new level. But most are aware that this is just something that is a new tool, if you like, in their diplomatic kit box. And they can use that, as any small state should, to maximise the benefits to their country in that process. In the long run, the values alignment with a lot of those smaller states in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean will see them do very well in those geostrategic contests for influence.
There are other issues within the Timorese economy that probably keep a lot of policymakers in this region up at night, as there are significant concerns about Timor-Leste's long-term economic output, particularly as even more of the population, rather than less, are becoming increasingly dependent on the country's oil and gas revenues, with the sector now accounting for an increasingly dominant share of not only the country's formal workforce, but also of the country's share of non-remittance income. Now, this not only makes Timor incredibly susceptible to price changes in the oil and gas market, but the real issue is that Timor-Leste's primary oil field, Bayu-Undun, is actually nearing depletion, leaving the country in a very urgent need to find a new source of revenue. The challenge, however, is that there aren't many viable alternatives around, as whilst there is the Greater Sunrise gas field, as we'll talk about later, that's been a source of contention for a very long time now, with negotiations and debates having gone on between Dili, Canberra and various energy firms for decades now. And beyond that field, other exploration efforts undertaken by the Timorese have also yielded very poor results, as whilst in oil-dense regions, like parts of Texas where you can pretty much just dig in the ground anywhere and find oil, out of the 97 exploration attempts that the Timorese have undertaken, only 8 have come back finding enough oil to make it even slightly economically viable, a success rate that is far too low to offer any sort of real economic security. So with Bayu-Undun running dry and no clear replacement in sight, many fear that the country is becoming an economic time bomb, with several key issues all now converging at once. So, how do they plan to fix it? And what options does the Timorese government still have open to it? Well, to answer that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. The Sunrise in the East.
I think what draws geopolitical interest towards Timor-Leste is its really prime geographic location. It's smack in the middle of the Indonesian archipelago, meaning that anything that happens in Timor-Leste has an outward impact on Southeast Asia.
Parker Novak is a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council's Indo-Pacific Security Initiative, as well as the Global China Hub and the Stokecraft Center for Strategy and Security, with Parker specializing in the geopolitics of East Timor, Southeast Asia, and the wider Pacific Islands. So, we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
Historically, you have had an economy largely dependent on oil and gas for not only state revenue, but also for, economic growth. I would characterize the current state of the economy as somewhat precarious. The IMF is projecting a growth rate of 3.1% as we go into 2025. The challenge there is a lot of that is ultimately driven by government spending, the sustainability of which is questionable in the long term for driving growth.
Now, this brings us to one of the most significant economic inflection points here in the region, this being the Greater Sunrise gas field. Now, this gas field is one of the largest untapped reserves anywhere in Southeast Asia, lying in the Timor Sea between Australia and Timor-Leste. And even though it was discovered all the way back in 1974, it's estimated to contain approximately 5.1 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. And yep, it remains undeveloped due to a series of geopolitical and economic hurdles between the two sides. Now, the reasons for this are numerous, but a key sticking point between the two sides until very recently has been the long-standing maritime border dispute between Australia and Timor-Leste, a dispute that would ultimately lead Timor-Leste to taking Australia to The Hague in order to try and get this solved. And even beyond that, the project for years now has been mired in controversy, including espionage scandals, political maneuvering, and accusations from all sides of political stonewalling by all of the stakeholders, each of which we'll delve into a little later on once we set up some of the basics here. The key point I want you to take away for now is that this gas field has massive economic potential. Now, as I said, these gas fields were discovered back in 1974, and negotiations have been going on for decades now. But what it seems is that things are now starting to speed up a bit, likely because things for Timor are starting to get a bit tight. Because, as we mentioned earlier on, If we look at their other joint project with Australia, the Bayu-Undun oil field, that field is currently nearing depletion, and yet still accounts for approximately 93% of the Timorese government's non-remittance revenues. Meaning that for Dili, getting this Greater Sunrise project operational is not just important, but essential. Now, with this added pressure put on the situation, both from the economic problems being experienced by Dili and China's influence growing within the region for Australia, the two sides have been a little more willing to come to the negotiating table, even overcoming the biggest hurdle in the process in 2018, when the governments of Australia and Timor Leste would finally agree on a maritime boundary between the two sides. Now, under this maritime boundary agreement, approximately 70% of the Greater Sunrise field would now fall within Timor Leste's exclusive economic zone, whilst the remaining 30% would lie within Australia's EEZ. However, before you start patting yourselves on the back and thinking this is all over, solving that dispute just meant we move on to the next one. The next one being over where that gas should be processed once it gets out of the ground. Now, as things stand, Timor Leste insists that the gas from Greater Sunrise should be processed domestically, specifically on the southern coast of Timor, arguing that the building of refineries and infrastructure is part of a broader economic diversification strategy that Dili is seeking to implement, with Dili going on to suggest that building an onshore liquefied natural gas processing facility would create jobs in the south of the country, enhance its national energy security, and catalyze economic development beyond its current dependence, with just the establishment of the facilities estimated to bring in $50 billion to the Timorese economy. On the other hand, Australia and its commercial partners are arguing for the processing of the gas to be done in Darwin in the north of Australia. Their argument centering on the fact that there's existing infrastructure in Darwin, as well as the required LNG export facilities and terminals, meaning that because all this infrastructure is already built, it is going to be significantly cheaper to get the project underway. The commercial partners in particular also argue that Timor Leste's limited infrastructure here in the south, all the way across the mountains from the north of the country and often in very isolated parts of the country, poses significant security risks to the project, and that the logistical challenges of building such infrastructure in such a remote part of Timor will not only be difficult, but also expensive and require incredibly costly insurance. Now, this disagreement over the processing location has become the key sticking point in these negotiations, with both sides still seemingly unwilling to compromise. But Parker, could you unpack this a little bit further? What are the stakes for both sides, and do you think there is any potential solution that'll keep everybody happy?
Sunrise has been stuck for a long time on how the gas is going to be processed. The two options you generally see debated are first, processing the gas largely through existing offshore facilities in Darwin, Australia. This is the option the Australian government has long preferred for a variety of reasons. On the other side of the equation, you have a distinct Timorese preference for processing the gas domestically in Timor Leste. The kicker there is that requires developing the processing capacity onshore from near scratch. The name that is largely used for that project is Tasimane, which would develop everything from refining facilities to a port to export gas, basically everything you would need onshore to do oil and gas. This has been distinctly the Timorese preferred option over the past decade or so. And I think another factor worth mentioning here is it's not just a government decision. You have three joint venture partners in the field, including Australia's Woodside Petroleum, the Australian branch of Osaka Gas, and the Timorese state oil company Timor Gap. Ultimately, they're the ones who are the venture partners, are the ones who would be developing the field, but the Australian and Timorese governments do need to sign off on whatever decision is made. So you have a complicated picture of both the private sector and government actors at play here.
Now, from what we can observe here, as a lot of this will be happening behind closed doors in boardrooms, the Australian government appears to be tacitly supporting the processing of the Greater Sunrise gas in Darwin, but also wants to make sure that Timor feels like it got a fair deal, even going as far as to offer Timor a larger share of the royalties and profits as an incentive if the gas were to be processed back in Darwin. However, at the same time, Canberra also seems to be hedging its position, attempting to balance both the strategic and economic interests here. As whilst publicly the Australian government has expressed willingness to see the additional investment into Timor Leste, including through the suggestion of infrastructure development and funding grants, by the language of the statement, it also seems it's most likely that the funds for these infrastructure programs would be coming from the profits of the gas field itself, effectively meaning that the development would not occur until the project becomes operational. And given that Darwin, as the only one with the necessary infrastructure in place, means that we're beginning to get into a chicken and egg scenario here. At this stage, though, the Australian government seems to just be deferring its final decision, stating that in the end, it will support whatever the commercial stakeholders deem to be commercially viable. This effectively places the momentum, as well as the blame if anything goes wrong, in the hands of Timor Gap, Timor Leste State Oil Company, Woodside, and Osaka Gas. And with the decision now falling to the commercial partners, the arguments become far more about economics than anything else. And that's the thing, the economics do raise some questions here. As whilst the value of this natural gas has risen since the original negotiations, the global landscape in gas has also shifted a bit, with renewable energy becoming far more viable, new gas deposits being discovered elsewhere worldwide, and many of these newer gas fields having far lower capital expenditure and requiring much less infrastructure than what Greater Sunrise would. And for the commercial partners, this probably raises some concerns about the long-term commercial viability of the project, particularly as it remains locked in political and logistical deadlock with Dili. As if the project does go Dili's way, there are concerns that one or two attacks on the facilities by angry locals may end up scaring investors away or upping the administration costs to a point where it stops being viable. But if it also goes Australia's way, the negative press being generated and any potential lack of cooperation from a future Dili government could also put the project's viability in doubt. Because as we've covered in previous projects before, when it comes to funding and operating oil and gas projects of this scale, quite often for commercial partners, they put a huge amount of capital up front and often end up losing money for the first few years. And where they make their money is on the back 2/3 of the project's lifespan. So any agreement signed today will likely require all of the interested parties committing to 30 to 40 year projects. So Parker, if we go back to the Australian government statement here, talking about how they'll support whatever's commercially viable, how much do you think that impacts the negotiations here?
So commercial viability has arguably been the biggest question around Tassimane since the idea was conceived in the early 2010s. There's a lot of questions about what it would cost, how quickly it can be developed, whether it would be developed on time, and furthermore, how would Tassimane be managed and run upon development. Those who are for developing Tassimane have pegged the cost at anywhere between 16 and 22 billion. The numbers have varied over the past few years on what you've seen publicly. They claim it'll be built by the late 2020s, depending when shovels go into the ground, and that it will be a pretty smooth process. However, I personally am still skeptical of the viability of Tassimane. I look at practical things like building delicate oil and gas processing infrastructure, where in any country in the world, infrastructure projects tend to be delayed, let alone when it comes to fragile infrastructure like the processing infrastructure we're talking about. And, we've seen time and time again, developing infrastructure in Timor Leste comes with its challenges. So ultimately, those contribute to what have been very persistent questions about the commercial viability of Tassimane. They've dogged the project for a long time, and I think they continue to dog the project as we look forward.
Even under some of the more optimistic projections, getting Tassimane off the ground would take anywhere between 7 to 10 years, and that's if shovels were to go into the ground today. In fact, even if Timor were to backflip on this and sign off on the gas being processed in Darwin, getting everything in place to do that would also take a couple of years, as Darwin gets some of the workforce and additional infrastructure in place. So none of this is an issue that can be solved tomorrow. And for Dili, all these challenges are then compounded by their rapidly depleting existing oil reserves. As at present, they really have no other major revenue stream ready to replace it. Now, there have been some suggestions that this means that as time progresses, Timor-Leste's negotiating position with the Australian companies is only likely to weaken. As the closer Timor-Leste gets to its fiscal shortfalls, the greater pressure they'll be under to reach any kind of deal, placing Dili under a ticking time clock whilst leaving the commercial partners to be relatively comfortable. Do you think this is shaping some of the decision-making around this project?
One could certainly look at it that way, particularly as you look at the trajectory of the Timorese Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is largely dependent on oil and gas revenue. So the longer you don't have oil and gas revenue coming in, you see the Sovereign Wealth Fund getting further and further depleted, which has a very direct impact on the Timorese state and its ability to operate. So I think to your point, one could say the longer you drag out negotiations, the more you could force them towards the offshore processing in Darwin. But I think that's also been an argument at play for a long time, and the Timorese haven't budged, partially because they think Tasimane can be developed fairly quickly. And that's a position that I think Prime Minister Guzmão has certainly held very strong to, and I think you've just seen a real gulf in perception on the timetable for development that has really kept negotiations stuck.
Now, Timor-Leste have been signalling that if Australia and its commercial partners are unwilling to move forward with the Greater Sunrise Project, that Dili would be willing to go looking for alternative partners to step in, with Dili suggesting potential collaborations with the Chinese, a couple of Middle Eastern states, or even the South Koreans as investors. Now, from a strategic standpoint, about having any large-scale Chinese offshore energy project operating just a few hundred miles from its northern command, particularly given that China often uses these sort of projects to install dual-use facilities, establishing things like radar and weather stations that, whilst being useful for tracking things like weather and temperature, by coincidence also have a lot of use in tracking things like planes and ships. But I guess the key question I want to ask here is, how much genuine interest have you seen from Beijing in actually getting involved in a project of this size?
That's a somewhat challenging question to answer. I mean, on one hand, you have seen the Timorese government claim for several years now that there is concrete interest from the PRC in developing Tasimane and financing the development of such. You've also seen Timorese officials claim that the South Koreans, the Indonesians, the Japanese, even the Kuwaitis were claimed as a recent possible source of financing. I've always seen the idea of non-Western financing, particularly from the PRC, as a negotiation tactic from the Timorese, where they're playing that card essentially to try to push Australia, Japan, aligned Western countries to the table to get them to do the investment, with the argument being, well, if you don't do it, we're just going to go to the PRC, which we know is very troubling and concerning to you. So you have seen a lot of speculation around PRC financing and also other sources of financing. But at the same time, there's been speculation about that for years and nothing has actually eventuated. I think any prospective investor, they see the same commercial viability questions that anyone sees about the development. And I think that's part of why that hasn't happened yet. I remember when I was living in Timor Leste in 2018 and 2019, talking about Chinese financing for Tasimane was one of the topics du jour at coffee shops, dinners, things of that nature. And here we are now, almost 6 years later, still having the exact same conversation.
Saying that though, there is an increasingly close relationship between Dili and Beijing, with China providing technical expertise to certain branches of the Timorese military, and a growing alignment between the two of them, with Dili and Beijing even signing a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement in September of 2023, a move that undoubtedly raised some eyebrows in Canberra. However, how much should we be reading into this deal? How much did it change the pre-existing dynamic between the two?
Whilst it is an important diplomatic development for the relationship, to me, it more so codified what was already happening on the ground between the two countries and within their relationship. I know there was some reaction in Australian media that really raised a level of concern. To me, I just didn't have that level of concern when it happened because, again, I spent a lot of time on the ground there. And it was already obvious then that the relationship between Timor-Leste and the PRC was growing at quite a rapid clip. It was becoming a positive relationship, and the growth of that relationship certainly concerned, I think, Australia and other parties. So to me, it was more a codification of things that were already happening with some nice flowery diplomatic language around it and a nice signing ceremony versus a true game changer in Timorese foreign policy.
If this relationship does continue to deepen though, could we see the relationship between these two developing in a somewhat similar manner to what we see between China and Cambodia, where Cambodia's economic dependence on China has paved the way for Beijing to establish dual-use infrastructure and military facilities within the country, as I imagine such a scenario would undoubtedly raise some concerns in Canberra, given Timor-Leste's strategic location. But how realistic do you think this scenario is? Do you think the Australians really should be concerned about China establishing a base here?
I think deep down that is ultimately what concerns the Australians, and I would say I think that also concerns the Indonesians as well. Given how much of a game changer any sort of Chinese military presence would be in the country due to its geographic location. With that said, that's something that gets bandied around, particularly in defense circles. whilst I think there's some validity to that concern, there are no real discussions about a Chinese military presence in the country right now. I think they would need to be very careful in that hypothetical scenario of what sort of reaction would you be eliciting from Australia and Indonesia.
From a defence and security perspective, Australia has played a long-standing role in Timor Leste, from its peacekeeping operations in the early years of independence to its ongoing defence cooperation efforts today, the two nations having formalised their partnership through a defence cooperation program, which includes the deployment of Australian advisors to Dili and Bacoor, as well as naval advisors and public service specialists to Port Hera near Dili. And on top of that, in September of 2022, Australia and Timor-Leste would further strengthen this partnership by signing a reciprocal defence cooperation agreement, this agreement having a particular emphasis on maritime security cooperation. But given all these developments, what do you think Australia's broader strategic objectives are here in Timor-Leste? What is Australia hoping to achieve here?
If I'm Australia, I want a vibrant, successful, stable Timor-Leste. If we look at Timorese history, where with the peacekeeping mission from 1999 to 2002, Australia was the primary contributor of peacekeepers to that force. And then when you had the 2006 crisis where the Timorese state almost collapsed, you saw once again Australia providing by and far the largest number of troops and police forces to the peacekeeping mission, which naturally can put a strain on Australian security and defense capabilities and have a knock-on impact on what they can do elsewhere. So I think there is a deep worry that I've consistently heard in Australian circles behind the scenes, where essentially the reason they're worried about instability in the country is they're worried if there is a regression to a 2006 type situation that Australia is going to be the country stuck holding the bag and trying to fix it.
The 2006 crisis being a dark moment in Timorese history, and one that nearly brought down the government that had just gained its own independence. And to give you the cliff notes, the crisis began with a mutiny in early 2006, when around 600 soldiers, that being roughly a third of the Timorese military at the time, would take to the streets protesting against alleged discrimination within the military promotions, as well as poor service conditions for the majority of the soldiers. Now, the government at the time would simply dismiss these accusations, stating that this was just a power grab by the military, but with neither side willing to back down, tensions would quickly escalate. And by May 2006, violent clashes would erupt throughout the country, with military, police, and street gangs, as well as politically aligned factions, carrying out widespread unrest and targeted killings across several major cities, with the end result being a further 150,000 Timorese citizens being displaced. And by June, with the chaos on the streets, the government had effectively collapsed, opening the way to a giant political vacuum and even more instability in the country. So, to restore order, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, and Portugal would work together to deploy a joint task force, that being Joint Task Force 631, the force going in to try and stabilise the situation, reclaim control of the streets, prevent further violence in the country. And once restored, would then be followed by a UN peacekeeping mission that would remain in place until 2012. A mission that Australia was a very significant part of. However, that's history, and I want to shift the focus back towards the modern stability challenges, one of the most significant being the growing geopolitical influence that Jakarta has over Timor-Leste, as despite Indonesia's history of occupation and brutal counterinsurgency campaigns, the economic reality is that today, Timor-Leste is increasingly reliant on Indonesia. As for the Timorese, an increasing amount of their imports, consumer goods, and second-hand vehicles all come into the country via Indonesia, and most goods being about 25% cheaper over the border in West Timor than they are in East Timor. And obviously, this creates a bit of a paradox, where the same nation that was once the primary source of conflict is now the country's economic lifeline. But given this dependency, how would you characterize the current state of relations between Dili and Jakarta? Is this just a relationship of convenience, or has Dili actually managed to repair the relationship between the two?
First, I want to rewind back to the 1999-2002 period, where they're coming out of a 25-year occupation, and ultimately coming out of that, their relationship could have been very poor. But you saw leaders on both sides of the equation, particularly senior Timorese leaders, take a very pragmatic approach for numerous reasons and really go out of their way to build a positive relationship with Indonesia, not only because Indonesia is also obviously able to exert significant influence over Timorese affairs on virtue of its size and location, but also as a way to promote post-conflict reconciliation, which I think is just a fascinating topic to explore because you have a lot of familial and interpersonal networks that overlap with both sides of the island. There are plenty of folks in East Timor who have relatives on the Indonesian side and vice versa. President Horta claims to have been the first foreign official, head of state, to have congratulated Prabowo Subianto on his election victory. And knowing the history of those two individuals, it's a really interesting dynamic that I think illustrates from a leadership level a desire for reconciliation, a desire to have a positive relationship between the two countries. In the end of the day, I think Indonesia is going to be by and far Timor Leste's most important foreign relationship. As you noted, there's a large import dependence, if you're the Timorese, on the Indonesians for things like consumer goods. Geographically, they're intertwined. Culturally, they're very intertwined. And from a people-to-people standpoint, they're also quite intertwined, where the countries are in many ways tied at the hip. And that's just the reality for both sides and really does impact their relationship.
Another key aspect of the Timorese economic plan is its aim to join the regional bloc ASEAN. However, as we covered in the previous segment, the road toward membership hasn't really been a straightforward one, with countries like Singapore expressing doubts on the financial state of the Timorese economy. And while Delhi appears to be looking down that roadmap now, some of their key financial indicators are trending in the wrong direction, which, when combined with the Timorese president's criticism of Myanmar's military junta, could complicate Timor's ascension into ASEAN. So Parker, what effect do you think the criticism of the junta will have? And is Timor still traveling in the right direction to becoming a member of ASEAN?
I think it's certainly going in the right direction, but it's also not a done deal for the reasons you cited. I do think public opposition has been pretty muted. You've seen a lot of public support to keep some of those concerns persisting, and that's why it's not a done deal. If you take a look at the membership roadmap that was rolled out in May 2023, there's not only the high and mighty, the country must meet all the requirements of the economic, security, and cultural pillars of ASEAN, the flowery diplomatic language. There's also very practical things like being able to host ASEAN meetings, ASEAN conferences, things of that nature. And that requires things like hotel space and having sufficient hotel space to host officials from 10 different countries and all the hangers-on that come along with them. And if you've been to Delhi, you know there's not a lot of hotels, where essentially you have a situation where they absolutely need more hotel space to host ASEAN meetings. And that's going to be an aspect of the membership pathway they have to meet. So I think overall, the trajectory is positive. There is momentum. It's not a done deal yet, though, and the Timorese need to do everything they can to assuage some of the quiet concerns.
Now, I think it's fair to say that Timor-Leste has overcome a whole bunch of very immense challenges over the years, and pretty consistently defied expectations to emerge as one of the most democratic states anywhere in Southeast Asia. However, with all of these mounting economic pressures, a weakening fiscal position, and the looming depletion of its oil resources, do you think the country is veering toward a pretty critical inflection point? With some analysts arguing that without urgent economic diversification and investment in sustainable revenue streams, the Timorese position will only continue to weaken as time goes on. So Parker, given these compounding challenges, is there still enough time left for the Timorese leaders to actually enact the meaningful reforms that are probably required?
I think the Timorese are aware some of these challenges need to be addressed. I would submit, if you look at the performance of the Petroleum Fund, which is what Timor ultimately relies on for state revenue, the fund does continue to perform better than expected. That's largely due to pretty robust performance of U.S. financial markets. The current capital balance, as of I believe it's Q3 2024, is $18.97 billion, which is notably higher than the balances that were projected by the IMF in 2022 and 2023 as we kind of projected the future of the fund out. So arguably that's bought Timor-Leste a couple more years to handle these challenges, figure out Greater Sunrise, start making tangible progress on economic diversification. But the trajectory the fund's on is ultimately contingent on two things. One, it's contingent on prudent fiscal management for the Timorese. And it's also contingent on continued strong returns, neither of which are a given and are really big ifs in many ways. I look at possible scenarios, whether it be, I guess, a regional or U.S. economic downturn, everything from a mild cyclical recession in the U.S. to a regional conflict around Taiwan could really send economic markets going in the wrong direction, which would have a very negative impact on the life of the petroleum fund and bring kind of an expiry date forward versus pushing it backwards. So with those contingencies in mind, the time is now for Timor Leste to be figuring out these issues, particularly in relation to Greater Sunrise. That is the single biggest factor as we look at Timor Leste's economic future and really its future as a state. You've seen a lot of effort from international donors towards it, but the reality is diversification to date just hasn't panned out as folks would like it to. Historically, that has focused on agriculture, tourism, and coffee. The results in those have clearly been suboptimal at best. You also see discussion about secondary sectors, whether it be basic manufacturing, mining, financial services, gaming, some of which are obviously more fanciful than others. We've seen limited progress on any of those. We're at a point now where remittances have become the second largest source of non-oil GDP and are continuing to grow. They're an important source of hard cash for the country. That's the positive thing, but it also brings in the downsides of labor migration and potentially losing the country's best and brightest to overseas labor migration and causing things to stagnate at home in Timor-Leste. So overall, the diversification picture is pretty limited.
Timor-Leste now finds itself at a geographic crossroads, positioned between a rising Indonesia, an increasingly assertive China, and a strategically nervous Australia, with the country finally being able to build up that new generation of public servants and expertise to properly solidify its institutional base, but at the same time dealing with private companies, inflicting a self-fulfilling prophecy upon the country. So, what options does Timor-Leste have going forward? Can it actually pivot towards sustainable economic growth? Or will the country find itself increasingly reliant on handouts from external powers? Well, to answer that, we turn to our final guest.
Part 3. A closing window.
The people who lead Timor-Leste now, and even the generation below them, have lived through and fought through decades and decades of war and massacres, and eventually came out as an independent country. The top leaders are still people who either were actually the leaders of the guerrilla war against Indonesia or were involved in the political side of the guerrilla war. And of all the countries in Southeast Asia, even though Timor-Leste is by far the poorest, it's also by far the most democratic.
Joshua Kurlantzick is a senior fellow for Southeast Asia and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations, specializing in Southeast Asian geopolitics. Prior to this role, Kurlantzick also served as a columnist for Time magazine and a correspondent for The Economist based in Bangkok, analyzing the rise of China and the changing geopolitics of Southeast Asia. In addition to all that, he's also the author of Beijing's Global Media Offensive, a book examining the rise of Chinese influence throughout Southeast Asian media. So we're thrilled to have him back on the program today.
Timorese are pragmatic, and it's well beyond buying goods. Some of those goods are actually not Indonesian goods, though. They're goods that have made their way from China to Indonesian traders, rather than just being goods that are produced in Indonesia. However, they are practical, and they know that their massive neighbor sits next door, and they have to deal with it.
Now, the major geopolitical development in this region has obviously been China's expanding influence, as well as its strategic engagements with a number of the key Pacific and Southeast Asian states, with Beijing signing a security pact with the Solomon Islands in April 2022, followed by an agreement to supply police equipment to Vanuatu in 2023, and all of it being capped off by the signing of a comprehensive strategic partnership with Timor-Leste in September of that same year. But beyond diplomatic and security engagements, Beijing has also placed heavy investment into Timor-Leste's critical infrastructure, with Beijing having financed the development of the T-Bar deepwater port, provided various levels of flood recovery assistance, funded large parts of the Suai Highway, and even funded the construction of the country's presidential palace in 2007. So it is somewhat easy to see how all of these projects combined have made some in Jakarta and Canberra slightly nervous of what's happening here in the region. However, with your background looking at China in a much wider context, what do you actually read from these agreements that have been signed between Dili and Beijing? Do you think these deals are somewhat indicative of a broader realignment happening in Dili? Or is this kind of just standard economic engagement practices between China and nations in Southeast Asia?
It is kind of a standard agreement, but Timor needs money from anyone it can get it. But in terms of your broader question, yes, China has built a significant amount of influence in Timor Leste in the past 10 years or so. The first decade of Timor's independence as a country, China seemed less involved. But in the last 10 years, China has made a huge push for influence and being the dominant influence in a wide range of Pacific countries.
Now, the United States has also shown increasing interest in the events happening in East Timor, particularly over the last decade, with Washington not only supporting infrastructure for electoral processes, but also investing in strategic infrastructure within the country. In recent years, Washington even funded the rehabilitation of Bacoor Airfield, a critical airstrip in the very northeast of the country, topping off the rehabilitation of the airfield by also donating Timor-Leste's sole military aircraft, a small Cessna 206. Now, we've also seen another pattern emerge among some of these smaller Pacific states, particularly with guys like the Solomon Islands, where in recent years, when Canberra or Washington appear disengaged with the country, one effective way to regain their attention is to start signaling some closer engagement with Beijing, knowing that the moment there's discussions of security pacts or infrastructure deals with China, that'll be when Australia and the US begin to panic and finally come back to the negotiating table with counteroffers, with more and more of these smaller states starting to either lightly or toy with the idea of playing this card going forward. But this raises a key question, because if a country does pursue that path, and the US and Australia don't come back to the table with a counteroffer, it may leave them cozying up to a partner they may not have wanted to in the first place. So this raises the key question: how strategically invested do you think the United States is in the long-term security of Timor-Leste? If Dili were to adopt some of these maneuvers played by the Solomon Islands, what do you think Washington's response would be?
That would be a major, major concern of the Pentagon, and they would try to stop it, but I don't know how, because the US's foreign aid budget is very little and Trump wants to slash it even more.
Now, from what it seems, one of the most complex bilateral relationships Timor-Leste maintains is its complicated relationship between itself and Canberra, with Australia seemingly oscillating between being a steadfast ally and a somewhat questionable neighbour. Take, for example, the events surrounding Indonesia's occupation of Timor-Leste in the 1970s, with Australia being the only country to formally recognise Jakarta's annexation, doing so in exchange for Indonesian recognition of a maritime boundary favourable to Australia. While that does sound terrible, it was also Australia that played a key role in convincing Indonesia to withdraw from the territory in 1999, and helping to guarantee the security of Timor-Leste's independence referendum. In fact, it was the Australian forces that led INTERVET, the International Force of East Timor, a multinational peacekeeping mission that helped stabilise the country post-referendum. However, there's also been other questionable things that Australia has done as well. As within months of Timor-Leste's formal independence in 2002, Australia decided to apply some significant pressure on the country, again over where the border would be demarcated, with Australia even withdrawing from the ICJ, or the International Court of Justice, as well as the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea jurisdictions, to shield itself from potential legal challenges that Timor was likely to launch. And as things in the country began to look unstable, and the peacekeeping mission was due to run out, Canberra pressured the newly independent Timor-Leste into signing the Timor Sea Treaty, which locked in Australia's control over significant portions of the Greater Sunrise oil and gas fields, and prevented Timor from launching any renegotiations of the border till 2057. But with that said, if you ask Australia did try and offset this by offering a much larger revenue sharing agreement to the Timorese, as well as ongoing military and bureaucratic assistance, and even today is still the largest provider of bilateral development funding anywhere in the world, providing about 21 to 38% of all official financial development funding anywhere in the country. However, being the possessive girlfriend we sometimes are, that wouldn't be the last questionable thing that Australia did to Timor, where in 2004, under the pretext of an aid project to renovate Timor-Leste's government offices, the Australian intelligence services would covertly install listening devices throughout most of the Timorese senior boardrooms and offices, with these listening devices being installed to gather intelligence on Dili's negotiating position over the Greater Sunrise fields. And one could argue that this intelligence provided Australia, as well as the Australian energy companies, with a significant advantage going into the agreement, with Australia now fully aware of what the Timorese positions would be and how low they'd be willing to go, with the two signing the CMATS Treaty just a little while later. Now, this scandal wouldn't stay quiet forever, erupting a few years later when whistleblowers came forward to the press, with the Timorese being furious at the invasion of privacy, and the Australian public furious that the Australian minister who not only oversaw the negotiations between Timor and Australia was also one of the ministers that greenlit the bugging of the officers, and that the minister would leave his role with the Australian government not long after the negotiations to take up a lucrative consulting role with the energy company involved in the negotiations. Which, of course, is unforgivable behaviour, and will forever be a black mark on our record. However, in 2006, when the country descended into riots, it was also Australia who was first on the scene to put their troops in harm's way and stabilise the situation. So, as you can see, the relationship between Dili and Canberra has been somewhat complicated to say the least, and even today can still be categorised as really anything but straightforward. And even if we look at a modern example, we can still see this same complicated to and fro between the two capitals, as in recent times, Canberra has sought to repair relations and strengthen its defence ties with Timor Leste by funding the modernisation of the Timorese Navy. Now, as a part of this agreement, Australia agreed to fund 2 Guardian-class patrol boats, aiming to replace the ageing Portuguese and Chinese patrol boats that were in use by the Timorese Navy. However, this is an agreement with Australia, so things are really that straightforward. As whilst Australia has fully funded and constructed these 2 Guardian-class vessels, even meeting its delivery deadline of 2023, both ships are still currently sitting in a dockyard in Western Australia. The Timorese refusing to take delivery of the ships, citing a lack of suitable port infrastructure at the Port Hera naval base, resulting in delay after delay for the delivery date. Now, there are some reports that indicate that Australia did previously agree to finance the refurbishment of this naval base, whilst others deny that Australia ever did. But as of now, the renovation of the naval base is yet to commence. The ships still remain in port in Western Australia, and the official communication on the matter still remains pretty minimal. So Josh, what is driving this latest impasse? Is it bad blood between these two sides? Or is it something purely logistical? Should we be reading into this that the Timorese may still hold some bad blood toward Australia?
It seems to me less like some sort of jostling diplomatically or something like they're angry at Australia about. Instead, it seems more like really poor planning by the Timorese side. They have a very, very, very tiny number of diplomats, technocrats, defense officials, as you would imagine in a country so small and where many of the smartest people fled the country over the years because it was so brutal there. Some have come back, but most never came back. I think that they just messed up. I think probably they asked for someone to help them upgrade Port Hera. And if that doesn't work, they go to someone else to upgrade Port Hera, probably China.
So all of the proposals put forward so far seem to suggest that Timor Leste must continue looking externally for the support it needs, relying on foreign partnerships to navigate its economic and strategic challenges. Now, whilst this is a logical and often necessary approach for a nation with a population of less than 1.4 million and a GDP of approximately just $2 billion, the broader question does remain. What avenues still exist for Timor-Leste to strengthen its economy domestically and reduce its reliance on external actors without also caving in to other countries' demands on things like oil and exports? Does Timor-Leste have the capacity to develop the necessary infrastructure, energy sector, investments, and economic diversification that would chart a more self-sufficient course for the country? Or do you think it will remain in a position where it just has to keep smiling while Australia, China, and Indonesia operate within their backyard?
I'm not sure that's possible. They're going to try, but it's a tiny country. It's like an ecotourism paradise, but it's really hard to get to and expensive. So the only way for them to get real tourism dollars is to sell themselves as a boutique destination that rich people will want to go to because they can get away from the rest of the world. Can they do that? I don't know. In terms of what other assets they have on hand and how soon those are going to go dry, I don't know much about other really good possibilities. It's a question of how much bitterness Timor is willing to eat.
As history shows us, Timor-Leste's had anything but an easy upbringing. For instance, if we look back under Portuguese colonial rule, the territory was little more than a neglected outpost, an economic and strategic backwater for Lisbon, and yet it still managed to run a well-functioning society, distinct with its own culture, language, and national identity. Then came the Indonesian invasion of 1975, resulting in a brutal 24-year occupation that would see an estimated 100 to 200,000 Timorese deaths. But despite that, the Timorese kept resisting, even when the odds seemed against them, and it was only after that decades of resistance that the Timorese finally won their right for self-determination. And yet, even after securing their independence in 2002, Timor's relationships with the rest of the world only became more complicated. Its former occupiers are now its main economic partners. Its former protectors, the Australians, have also been the ones spying on them over the years. And its former economic lifeline, offshore oil and gas, has now become both a blessing and a curse to the country's overall economy, with the resource fueling dependency and likely preventing the necessary economic diversification. So where does Timor Leste go from here? Well, that's the tough question, as the country's leadership faces a demographic and economic time bomb. Ruling over a nation where over 60% of its population is under the age of 25, all while reports of youth dissatisfaction are on the rise, economic diversification efforts seem to have stalled, and increasing numbers of Timorese are leaving the country to seek viable employment opportunities elsewhere. As whilst at the same time as the oil fields begin to dry up, negotiations over the greater Sunrise oil and gas fields are increasingly slipping out of Timor-Leste's control, as regional powers maneuver to secure greater stakes in the project, as regional powers become aware that time is likely on their side. The unfortunate reality is that Delhi must confront multiple critical challenges simultaneously, and whether it can do it is still yet to be seen. What I will say though, is that for a nation that has endured colonialization, occupation, and betrayal, and yet still emerged as one of the most democratic and functioning states in Southeast Asia, well, it may just have what it takes to defy those odds once again. Thank you so much for checking out the show this week. We always enjoy doing these really small country episodes, because almost every time we cover one of these tiny nations, it's always incredibly fascinating, with a whole bunch of really interesting stories just under the surface. Saying that though, being such a small country always makes the research a little difficult. But regardless of which, we hope you enjoy it, and you can also walk away knowing that if you made it this far, you're probably in the top 1% for knowledge on Timor-Leste's geopolitics. Now, if you did like what we did here, and you want to hear more episodes like it, you can do so by following all of our links and info on Twitter, Reddit, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle @MikeElliottOz. Oz is in Australia. This show can only function with the support of our amazing Patreons who donate a small amount of money each month to help myself and the team keep the show going. And speaking of our amazing Patreons, this week I'd like to thank JW, Tony, Merrin Hale, Patrick Collins, Philip Rice, Matthew Walter, Stephanie Taylor, Dunstan Griffin, J-Man152, Gabriel Exposito, Timberwolf, Chris O, DK, James Lamon, Stephen Brown, and Obama Momium. This show is only possible with the support of listeners like these guys, whose donations help keep this show going, and we cannot thank them enough. So, if you feel you can spare a couple of dollars and you want special access to our full video presentations and maps exploring topics like the outcomes of a 2024 renewal of the Russo-Georgian War, or even our latest live stream with full maps and timelines for the fall of Assad, showing the tactics used by the rebel campaign, well, you can do so by jumping onto our Patreon today via the links in the description, and we'd greatly appreciate it. But for now, this episode on Timor-Leste is all thanks to you guys. As usual, here are our 3 book recommendations. The first being Crossing the Line, Australia's Secret History in the Timor Sea by Kim McGrath, for a much deeper look into the scandals surrounding Australia's negotiations with Timor-Leste. The second being East Timor by Owen Peter, for a slightly dated but great overview of some of the historical events that brought us to where we are today. And the third being East Timor, a newly independent country by Philippe Korforos, for a slightly different perspective on the growth of the Timorese state. I want to thank this week's guests, Michael Leach, Parker Novak, and Josh Kurlantzick. All of you were absolutely fantastic to have on for this one. And I'd also like to give an additional thanks to the primary researchers for this piece, them being Ben Nutter, Jamie Tanu, Jonah Gunn, Genevieve Donnellan-May, Robbie Sutton, and Sean Cotter-Lem. When it's a country of this size, it's always a lot more difficult to try and drag up the information necessary. So I can't thank you enough. In addition to those guys, I'd like to thank Cameron Gale, the producer, Jack Shankman, the production manager, Danielle Ujivella, Nate Ostilla, Robbie Sutton, Nick McNally, Jemima Pentreath, Ben Nutter, Genevieve Donlan-May, Perry Grace, Gabriel Lane, Lorenz Van Kierbulk, Ben Spencer, Andrew Gundle, Isaac Gibbs, Scott Missler-Ferguson, and Sean Cotterlem, our research assistants and writers, Jamie Tanner, our media director, Raul Devanarayanan, our resident analyst, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, as well as Kashyap Maheshwari and Alexander Vulgarten from our online team, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Alexia Heimakainen, our Discord moderator, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. There's no way we'd ever be able to produce a show like this without this amazing team. And lastly, I want to thank you once again for checking out the show this week, and let you know that the Red Line will be back in a few weeks with another international episode. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Red Line podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.